right, everyone, we'll be getting started here in just a couple minutes. If you want to start finding your seat, this is the panel breakout. If you're in the wrong place, now's the time to go. All right, we got Eliana microphoned up here. Okay, while she's doing that, I'll go ahead and start some introductions. So welcome, everyone, to the panel breakout this afternoon at the Field Advisor Forum. I'm Jennifer Jones, and I'm a research specialist with the ISA, and we just want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. So today's discussion is going to focus on the latest updates from the University of Illinois breeding and variety trials. So I'm excited to be joined by our two panelists. We have Dr. Jessica Rutkoski and Dr. Eliana Monteverde, both here at the U of I. Before we get started, I have just a couple of housekeeping items. If you are a CCA, we have CEU credits at the sign-in sheet, and it's available after the session. I believe that'll be in the side room over there. This panel is also being live streamed on YouTube, so if you want to share the link out, now's your chance to share it with your friends to let them tune in. So really quick, I'll do some introductions of our panelists. We have Dr. Eliana Monteverde here. She's an assistant professor and plant breeder in the Department of Crop Sciences at the University of Illinois. She leads the soybean breeding program at UIUC, where she also teaches and advises graduate students. Her research focuses on seed composition traits, helping soybeans play a critical role as a global source of oil and protein. Dr. Monteverde earned master's degrees in biology and genetics from Peterson in Uruguay, and a PhD in plant breeding from Cornell University. And then we also have Dr. Jessica Rutkoski, who is an assistant professor in the College of Aces at U of I. She specializes in small grains breeding and quantitative genetics, leading the winter wheat breeding program here at U of I. Her mission is to develop wheat varieties that enhance farm profitability in Illinois and neighboring states. Her research integrates technologies like remote sensing and genomics to improve plant breeding and variety evaluation. Dr. Rutkoski earned her PhD in plant breeding from Cornell University and spent 5 years supporting plant breeding programs in developing countries before joining the U of I. And please help me give them a warm welcome. All right, so we do have a panel set up today, but we're standing because they're both going to take a second to do an introduction through slides. So Jessica, we'll let you go ahead and kind of kick off with your introduction and brief overview of what you do at U of I.
Yeah, so it's an honor to be here as a wheat person in a group of soybean people. So I'm a wheat breeder. I work on improving wheat production, and I focus a lot on improving double crop profitability because that is, 80% of the state's wheat is grown ahead of soybean. So I have these 3 bullet points here, kind of summarizing what I work on that is relevant to this group. And so I work on developing elite, early maturing wheat varieties and also helping private companies, identify varieties among their germplasm that are also high yielding and early. So we have our own breeding program. We also help private company breeding programs get the data they need to make those decisions. We also provide official performance data on wheat with the variety testing program, providing all the important agronomic traits as well as maturity time so that we can get better standardization of when these varieties mature. Different companies have different scales and they call things by different names. It's not quite like in soybean varieties, you have the numbering system, and wheat varieties don't really have that. So we're providing that standardized data so that you can really compare apples to apples across a bunch of different companies and their varieties. And also we have some research that we're looking into identifying varieties of wheat that lose moisture more quickly. So we think there may be variation in that as a trait. So we may be able to that may be able to help us improve yield with and get early varieties, because usually there is a trade-off. Usually earlier varieties would tend to be lower yielding, so we're always looking for ways to break that. So just want to point out with our variety testing aspect of the research program, we provide data on varieties wheat varieties released in the state. This data is available online, so you can look at yield across locations, test weight, and then something that is new is maturity time and jointing time. Maturity time is critical because with double crop soybeans, the sooner you can harvest wheat, the earlier you can plant. And as we saw earlier, well, you lose half a bushel soybean yield per day the later you plant. So earlier wheat means planting the soybeans earlier, better yield in the soybeans. So just saying we have all this data online. This is just a snapshot of one of the tables. So you can Google search wheat variety testing, you'll find it. And I just want to talk a little bit more about the maturity and the jointing time information because this is new and maybe unfamiliar. So did it work? There we go. So if you look at, this is the growth cycle of wheat, all the different stages of development. So a critical one, which happens in March, usually, is jointing. That is when the wheat becomes vulnerable to spring freeze. So, or any, just freeze, right? But it's spring at that time. So temperatures below 26 degrees Fahrenheit will cause damage to the crop. So we don't want too early of jointing because then you'll be vulnerable to freeze. And then the last one over there is maturity. That's usually late June. So what when we're trying to select for earlier maturity, sometimes we get earlier jointing, and that's bad. We don't want that. So we want to identify earlier varieties that don't joint early. Okay, so that's why we're providing this information and evaluating it. So in that table I showed you, you have maturity time. You also have the jointing time. So you want to try to, if you're looking for an early variety of wheat for your double crop soybeans, you want early maturity, right? But you do not want early jointing. You want normal or late. So you want to avoid early jointing when you're selecting the early maturing varieties. Okay. This is a picture actually just to show you the impact of freeze damage after jointing. Last year was a perfect storm for getting freeze damage in wheat. And we have so many plots, you're bound to see it somewhere. And we did find some plots that got completely damaged by spring freeze. This picture, right, so you can see that wheat is very unhappy looking, right? It's like there is no grain in those heads. You walk past the plot and it's broken stems with no grains. So the frost will damage the stem and it will cause sterility. So it can be a really big deal. So you do not want early jointing. So if you're interested in looking for a good wheat variety for double cropping, I have some tips here. Consider yield as well as maturity time because maybe it'll be very early and you'll gain soybean yield, but if the yield is too low on the wheat, that will not help you in terms of profitability. So you got to consider both. You want to avoid the varieties that joint early. That is critical. And remember the other important traits too, right? It's test weight, scab resistance, all those other things still matter. All right, that's the end of my summary. So I can pass the baton to Eliana.
Yep. Thank you, Jessica.
Yep.
So, hello everybody. And are they coming up?
Do we have Eliana's slides?
It's okay if we don't. There were only 2 slides actually, but well. So what I'm going to talk about right now is the 2 projects we have running with ISA now. So as Jennifer said, our program is 100% conventional, non-GMO. And one of our focuses, of course, yield increasing, but also, but also focusing on seed composition traits too, both like protein and oil, of course, but I would like to focus on other nutrition components of seed components too. And I'm just trying to see if my slides are there. No, it doesn't. It's fine, don't worry. So one of the projects we have now with ISA is evaluation and commercialization of soy lake varieties. So soy lake varieties are lines that have a modified fatty acid profile. So the oil that is extracted from these varieties is high in oleic acid and low in linolenic acid. This makes for a much more healthy oil because it's low in saturated fats. And also this oil, because of the low linolenic, makes it extends the shelf life of this oil, and it doesn't get rancid as fast as regular soybean oil. The idea of this project is to recover that market share that was lost of soybean oils that were lost to palm oil and canola oil. So again, this trait is a non-GMO trait and is composed by 4 genes, 2 for the high oleic and 2 for the low linolenic. These 4 genes are patented by the University of Missouri, so we license these genes from them. And this project, what allows us is to evaluate our lines in more environments. So we're currently evaluating our lines, our soy lake lines in 6 different locations across the state. And we have been releasing varieties since 2022. So, and our varieties are now available to sell. So then the second project we have with ISA is diversifying the resistance, genetic resistance to soybean cyst nematode, or SCN. So as you know, one of the main sources of resistance we have for SCN is the 88788 resistance, which is composed by 1 gene. We've been playing with this resistance gene for over 20 years, and now we're seeing that there is a resistant break of these varieties. So now the nematode is able to overcome this resistance. Then we have the peaking type of resistance, which is composed by 2 genes. And then we have a bunch of other genes that were detected that we know they provide resistance to SCN. The idea of this project is to develop and evaluate both varieties with 88788 resistance plus other SCN resistance genes, and varieties with peaking resistance plus other genes too. Sort of try to so these varieties will have like a broader resistance to more HE types, and also this resistance, the idea is like to be more, we can extend this resistance over time too. And thanks to this project, we are able to both develop and introgress these resistance genes, and also to evaluate these lines in the field. And yeah, that's all I had to tell you about this project.
Great, thank you, Eliana, Jessica. So they kind of set the scene for us of what they're working on, some of their ISA-funded checkoff research, but also just what they do in general. So hopefully that got your gears turning on some questions that you might want to ask these 2 experts. But I'll go ahead and kick it off with a couple questions here while you guys think about what you want to ask. So both of you are involved in some capacity with the variety testing here at U of I that's run by, we have Clay Harper here in the room and Darren Juice, who also run the variety testing. So what kind of collaboration do your programs have with the variety testing?
Mm-hmm. Well, in our case, the soybean program, we collaborate with variety testing. So most of our locations outside of Urbana are ran by they go through variety testing. And also, we also collaborate with help. So technicians in my program, they also help with variety testing too.
Yeah, in our case, we took it on, all the testing, so planting, harvesting, phenotyping, and summarizing the data. So basically the majority of the work, except Darren Darren has been still coordinating a little bit with people participating, so we work together in that aspect. But it's been great for us because we are able to get all the contacts on, good trial coordinator, trial cooperators. And in our breeding program, we are using the same locations as the variety testing program, and so we kind of consolidated and made it more efficient. And then, and also it's been really interesting learning about all the companies' varieties and how their characteristics and how they compare to ours. And so we've learned a lot in that process. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Jessica, you talked about traits that are important in wheat in the double crop system. Eliana, are you and Jessica collaborating through the VT program to actually look at the double crop system in different parts of the state?
We are not currently, but that's something I would definitely.
So the
like to
question,
talk about.
sorry, the question was if these two are collaborating through the variety testing to look at the double crop system. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, we're not doing that as of now, but it's definitely something at least I am interested in.
Yeah, it's a very good idea.
Yeah.
It's I'm a little hesitant about doubling the testing program, of course, because of the resources involved. But yeah, we definitely should look into it.
Yeah, especially because, so Jessica's project that's funded through ISA is looking at, as she mentioned, at jointing time and trying to get soybean varieties in earlier after wheat for double crop. And so I know these two, I've been in conversations with them where they've kind of chatted about, oh, maybe we can look at different varieties of soybean after the wheat together and different things. So I think there's definitely stuff that will be coming down the pipeline. So if you're in the room and you have suggestions too, I know these two have always been open to hearing suggestions from growers around the state too. So, question in the back.
So you're talking about variety testing year to year. And over time, you've seen less and less of that available. And it seems to me that there's a lot less participation in the major companies that are compared in the variety testing. Is there anything you can learn to get wider participation across the industry?
Okay, so the question was basically there's less participation of larger companies in the variety testing, and how are we able to get more companies involved? And I guess, I don't know if the two of you feel comfortable answering that, but we also have Clay Harper in the room who maybe can chime in as well.
Well, I think on the wheat side, the size of the trials or the number of participants has remained pretty high through the years, but I think that it's gone down a little bit more for the corn and soybean, and I'm not really sure why. I think there's other providers of data, like First, there's like some other companies that are offering that. So on the wheat side, that does not exist. So I think that is probably a big factor.
Yeah, that's definitely a factor in soybeans. I mean, we have that difference. We have like these big companies that are involved in soybeans here in Illinois, but they're not so much with wheat, so that's why we have less competition in that sense.
Here, I have a microphone for you.
The first trials definitely seem to be the biggest competition for the variety testing program. And my conversations with the seed companies, the entries for our program have been cut down because they've increased their entries in the first program. I'm only going into my second season of managing the variety testing program, so I'm still working with the companies to see what we can do, but I'm hopeful that this year we don't take a big drop in entries.
Yeah.
Is there a correlation between early jointing and yield? And what is the highest yield that you've ever had?
So we're still understanding the jointing time because this is the first year we measured it. So, but based on what we've observed initially, there's sort of an optimum. So you don't want too late of jointing and you don't want too early. You want it to be in the middle. And because we've seen like the joint's really late, the yield's really bad, very on the extreme end, but the extreme early is also bad. So sort of you want the middle ground. In theory, slightly earlier jointing, if you didn't have the spring freeze issue, in theory, you could have a longer period of that stem elongation phase that would be beneficial for yield. But I don't really see that in our environment. I think there's so many other factors with the weather. Was there another question? Oh yeah, the highest yield I've seen like in a research plot, I think 160 bushels per acre, yeah. Probably higher, but then I didn't believe that number. So that's the highest one that was believable.
What was the unbelievable one?
Like 170. I don't know. It's just, yeah, I don't believe it, but 160 I can believe.
So Jessica, what do you think the northern limit for double crop is? You know, I've been around here for 40 years, and we could never double crop in Champaign until fairly recently. So how far is it going to go with your earlier varieties?
So, you know, that's a good question. With time, I think it will just creep north, like how it's creeping. But, you know, if you think of the state like divided into sections, like south, central, and north, it's like now it's central is becoming, that's double crop area. So eventually, maybe it will, if the trend continues, then in 30 years, northern Illinois will be double cropping as well. So that's my guess.
How far north is it now?
Like central Illinois.
Okay.
I mean, even then, central, it's sort of not I mean, the results are maybe not reliable enough to get a lot of people interested. But then there's always the issue of like corn is very high yielding in this area, so economically maybe it won't make sense. But you never know in 30 years.
I'm seeing it more in Knox County, that's for sure.
Say, do we have any double
Yep.
croppers in the room now, too?
Hold on, John, 1 second. Okay. Let me run. I'm a mic runner now.
I think whether or not the double cropping or the wheat production region moves significantly north in force is just one part of the component, because if we can get better utilization of good earlier varieties from here south, the impact on the bean profitability in the double crop is something that could be the bigger component and provide other options, you know, maybe as we creep north. But so I don't think it's an either or type of a proposition.
Right.
And a question for Eliana on the little, is it the linolenic? My tongue tie is messed up. I've heard from some folks that from companies that were interested in the processing of those beans for the oil quality, and they have led me to believe or told me that originally they were kind of looking at locating production areas and processing in the South, say Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, in that area, because the bean, that type of bean growing in higher temperatures tended to promote more expression of that oil or different quantities of that. And so, and is that the case that you're seeing, or how you know it, or was I led astray?
Well, in our case, our oil, so we know it's the oleic oil is higher than 80%, and the linolenic is lower than 3%. So it's a very high quality oil, and I think right now is the kind of like the best you can have. As far as oil composition in the South, I haven't heard much of it, but in general, seed composition traits tend to do better in the South than in the more north you go of the U.S., the worse both protein and oil quality get usually.
Sure. In part of my conversations with them, I encourage them to look at locating in Illinois versus down there because of the problems with herbicides and weed resistance and things there that are much worse than they are here. Plus, we have better processing and transportation capabilities to serve that type of market. Plus, we've got a tremendous amount of double crop acres, so if we could grow those beans, if that was the case, that the expression or the quality was more in a hotter environment, to place those in a double crop environment here would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, that could be. I know we have a process, non-GMO, at least oil processing plant in Indiana. That's the closest we have, and that's when it's quite new.
Thank you.
Yeah. So on the vein of Soy Lake, Eliana, how do those varieties yield-wise compare to like the Pioneer Plenish variety, which is their high oleic, low linolenic, and then compared to a commercial check as well?
Right. So all of our trials, multi-environment trials of our Soy Lake varieties, we use both Plenish and Pioneer non-Plenish checks. And our varieties usually, the best ones, they yield higher, a little higher than Plenish, like between, the ones we choose are usually like 104%, 105%. Some have been 110% over Plenish varieties. And compared to Corteva checks, Pioneer checks that are not Plenish, they are close to like 90%, 98%. So usually one trend we see with high oleic, low linolenic is that high oleic, low linolenic varieties, whole varieties, they tend to yield less than conventional non-whole varieties. And we yet don't know why, but that's the case also with Plenish varieties compared to Corteva non-Plenish varieties too. They usually tend to yield less than, Plenish varieties tend to yield less than non-Plenish varieties for the same company. So this is a trend we are seeing. We're trying to overcome that trend, and I think over time we could, but with more breeding, we'll be able to, but it's a trend we're seeing right now.
Yeah. Oh, Kelsey's coming with the microphone, sorry.
How is aggregation and distribution of those soy lake lines being handled? So you talked about that plant in Indiana. Are there aggregators operating in central Illinois that are taking people's crops and then bringing them there, or are the growers responsible for trucking?
So as far as I know, I don't know. I don't know much. So but all that information is in the Soy Lake website. No.
Yes, and I was just going to pull up an email from a colleague, actually, too, who works on the market development side at ISA, and we were discussing where the solvent extraction plants are in Illinois for just non-GM in general, not Soy Lake specifically, but there is ADM in Decatur and Cargill and Bloomington, and then International Flavor and Fragrance in Gibson City. So there's also a small organic GM expeller based in Tampico, Illinois. So as far as like Soy Lake specifically, there isn't a plant that's dedicated to that solely yet, but those others will take them.
Yeah, as far as I know, here in Illinois, we don't have any. So the closest one is the one that is in Indiana.
Yeah. Yeah.
On wheat breeding, when you start looking at maturity levels, the vast majority of growers, especially in the central Illinois belt, once we get out of what I'd call wheat country, all they see is early maturing, mid, and full season. Can you kind of break into a little bit of what is really, days that separate that? I feel like it could be 1 or 2 days, and growers get really worked up on it. And I didn't know if you had thoughts or an opinion as to what really makes that maturity range or classification.
Yeah, so first of all, just to give you the range that we see in the varieties that we're testing in the variety trial is 9 days. So that's a 9-day difference in maturities. And that is, that's like from the earliest to the latest. And I would have to emphasize there that most companies do not enter their very early varieties in the trial because they know it might not compete head to head with the later ones. So they will usually not enter those. And we're trying to encourage them to test them more, so we're working on that. But so that's a 9-day range within, and that's like kind of excluding the ultra early. So I think if you included it, maybe it'd be 10 or something like that. So a 10-day range total, probably. And the different groupings, it's about 2 days in between them. So there's a lot of different categories. So there's like late. Interestingly, nobody classifies their varieties as very late. So there's just late, and not very many people classify them as late. Probably nobody. But in my table, I start with late. Okay, so there's late. 2 days later, on average, will be medium, and then there's medium early. 2 days later, medium early, and then there's early. That's another 2 days. Then 2 days after that would be very early, and then I think that's where I called it. But there's other, like, companies will use even like very, very early, ultra early, and there's another category now, hyper early. So it's all over the place, and that's one of the objectives of our project here, is to provide the standardized data so that you actually know what you're getting, because you could call it whatever you want, practically, unfortunately. But I'd say, yeah, you can expect the range. So, for example, like one of the most popular Pioneer wheat varieties is like 25R74, was popular for a long time. That's considered a medium early. So then probably the ultra early, whatever a company would be calling ultra early, is probably 5 days earlier than that one. These are rough estimates, but just to give you something, yeah.
Hold on, Stephanie. I'm coming.
And I know most people may know this, but you may not know this. Even in soybean varieties, I'm used to have my marketing hat on. And just because they say it's a 3.4 doesn't mean it's a 3.4. We could have had a gap in our lineup, and we needed a 3.4, so we made one a 3.4. So you have to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
More questions? Oh, coming back at you.
Any trends in bearded versus non-bearded varieties in those trials, especially if it comes down to your joining timing?
That's something I haven't really looked at, but just based on observations, I have not seen any real genetic difference between the bearded and non-bearded. There are obviously, where the variety comes from is going to be associated with the head type. So certain breeding programs are going to basically always give you bearded, and the other breeding programs are going to give you smooth. And then there's different like strengths of those programs. So what you observe, like say, oh, well, these bearded lines are always like later. It may be because it came from a breeding program that has later varieties and bearded. So when you see, there is no real genetic cause of that. It's just associated based on where it comes from. Yeah.
So Eliana, when you were describing your projects, you were talking about the new SCN project you have with us. Do you have like a timeline on when those varieties might become available to growers?
So last year, yes. So last year we released 3 varieties that had, I call them enhanced peaking resistance, and 1 variety with 88788 enhanced 88788 resistance. So this enhanced peaking resistance have like 1 additional resistance, SCN resistance gene, and the 88788 have 2 SCN resistance genes in addition to 88788. So those varieties were released in 2024, beginning of 2024. So they went to seed increases in 2024, and now they should be available. So we as the university, we don't commercialize our varieties, so we license them to third parties. In our case, our SCN varieties, not the Soy Lake one, but all of our other varieties are mostly licensed to Baird seeds. And yeah, so they should be able, and Baird seeds.
Okay, and that's Baird, like B-A-I-R-D?
Yeah.
Okay, Baird. So is that based out of like Northern Illinois, or do you know?
Williamsville.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay, Stephanie.
Surprise, I have another question. So I've just recently learned some new things that I guess I never thought about before. I used to, work for a seed company, and now I'm on the other side where we're helping to fund all this great research. But let's say you discover this great big new trait or something awesome, right? Or something that's big. What challenges are you up against to try to get a company, a larger company, seed company, to, for example, new SCN resistance?
Mm-hmm.
What steps do you have to go through, or what help do you need, or what are the challenges to get that basically your latest and greatest new thing into the industry?
Yeah, so, well, on the one side, there's all like the legal side, which is handled by the university. It's like, doesn't have to do with me. But also another thing would be advertisement. And so I'm working on developing a website for the program, but of course, ISA's help, would be a great help in order to advertise if we ever discover that great trait. Yeah. That would,
Oh, me?
Oh.
Like to get to disseminate varieties more, or? That's a good question. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I don't know. I need a sales team, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah, me too. One of the things I would love to have, but yeah. And also by me personally, I'm not great with social media. So that's another, disadvantage. But yeah, so now that I'm having more students, we're going to open our Instagram website and Twitter, or whatever it's called now, website. And yeah, so the idea, if they can handle it, we can advertise what we do in more platforms and to a bigger audience too. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions from the crowd?
Oh, I have to say one thing. Yeah. So this goes back to the bearded smooth thing. Our breeding program is mostly all smooth head varieties, and there's companies a lot of times say, well, we only want bearded. So sometimes that is a barrier to, I have a great thing, but so-and-so only wants a bearded line, so I can't.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, yeah.
How do you guys engage with farmers to hear what their needs are, and then are there ways that farmers can engage with companies to help share your needs?
Well, I think, just attending these events, and, I am on the board of the Illinois Wheat Association, so I interact in that capacity. But yeah, really pretty limited, I would say, in that area. But so yeah, these questions and these forums are really useful in kind of getting that hearing. Even just listening to other people's presentations and the panel is really important.
Yeah, they're a good way to advertise what we do. Of course, ISA's help. ISA is a big help for us to also advertise our work, and yeah.
Hold on one second.
Oh.
Coming around.
So in your research, what has been the biggest surprise for both of you? Did you go, oh my gosh, I didn't know that, or didn't expect that?
Do you want to go first?
I'm thinking.
Okay. Okay. I have a few. I have a lot. So probably too many to talk about up here. But there, I like to say, almost every time that you go to a field and take notes or pay attention to what you're doing, you see something that you don't understand, and you don't know why. It's interesting, it's weird, and you're like, why? And you don't know what it means, so there's just so much. And then there's a lot of things you read in the textbooks or in the handbooks, and then you go to the field and you're like, no, that's not correct.
Yeah,
So
sometimes they contradict what you see in the field, or the observational aspect. It contradicts what the textbooks say.
So, for example, something related to jointing time. So we were measuring this in the field, right? And then I was in a field, and there was a part of the field that it missed the nitrogen, like the application. It was, the cooperator had to miss a patch because not to spray ours twice, something like that. So there was a whole patch that did not get the nitrogen application in the spring. And I'm taking the notes, and then I decided, I should check this and compare to the one that got the nitrogen, because I want to see if the nitrogen affects the jointing time. And both were jointing at the same time. So that one that had missed the nitrogen was jointing at the exact same time as the one that got the nitrogen, and they looked completely different. The one that didn't get nitrogen looked like there was no biomass. It was really bad looking, really bad. And when you look at it from afar, you would think this is just vegetative wheat, this didn't joint. But when you go and cut the stem, it's jointed. So that's something that's written in the books, and everybody believes that nitrogen timing effect, if you put nitrogen on, you will cause the wheat to joint. And then I saw that that was just an example of a surprise.
Yeah, so one thing in my case, right now I'm revising historical data from the breeding program and data from many different locations. And one of the things that really surprised me was how much protein content varies across locations, different locations in Illinois, across years too. Of course, you kind of have that idea that protein depends on environment. Protein content is dependent on the environment. But I didn't know sometimes I see differences of 4 or 5% between locations for the same lines. And that actually surprised me a lot. I didn't know the variation was so big. And that can really, if you're looking for a high protein variety, that can really, that really affects the amount of protein you can extract from your crop, depending on where you planted it, or how good or bad that year was. So that really surprised me. And you don't see that big variation in oil content. So there's a huge variation in protein content, and also I'm looking also at amino acid profile within these lines, and also there's a huge variation on amino acid content, particular amino acids. They vary greatly across locations, and that was very surprising to me. So it's kind of protein has to be treated the same way as yield in that sense.
You have time for one more? One more question?
Yeah.
Oh, there's two.
Maybe a couple more.
Yeah, Jessica, I'm convinced that part of the problem with double crop is the wheat straw, that inhibit in the soybean.
Yeah.
And I realize, early grain is great, but is there variation in harvest index among soybean varieties? And could you select for one that had high harvest index, which would be less straw?
You mean the wheat, right?
Yeah, wheat. Yeah, I'm sorry, wheat.
No, yeah, that's a good question. So you're saying, are you thinking shorter or fewer tillers?
No, just a higher harvest index. I guess it's 50% in wheat, and if it was 60, I'd have a higher yield with less straw.
Yeah, I think that's going to be hard to achieve. I don't think it's unachievable, but biomass and yield's pretty highly correlated. So I know some people say that, don't know if this is true, that there is certain aspects of the straw that are more desirable for double cropping. Apparently there's some varieties that they say when it just the straw disintegrates. And so I don't know what that means in a scientific term, but there could be something there too.
Did you say there was one more?
There was one more in the back.
Okay.
Or maybe on.
We just have time for one more, really. We got to switch here in a bit.
Okay.
Which one?
I think
in the back.
this one first.
They'll be around afterwards, right?
Yeah.
You can ask questions.
Kind of piggybacking off of that, like Central Illinois, we really struggle to get double crop to work if you do try it. Have you guys looked at like strip cropping with that, where you're planting a 40-inch strip of your wheat and then coming in April 15th with your 2 rows of beans and then cutting the wheat over top and kind of letting the soybeans grow up underneath that?
So you're talking like relay cropping? Yeah. Yeah. No, we haven't gotten into that. I've heard a lot of mixed information. Some people say that it's very difficult to get that to work on any kind of scale. So I've been avoiding that for that reason, and just because it's, people are not very many people are enthusiastic about it. There's a few people that are enthusiastic, but it's a very small number, so don't know.
Eliana, have you heard anything about relay cropping?
No.
No. All right. Well, I think we need to wrap up so you guys have time to transition. So let's go ahead and thank our panelists, Jessica and Eliana. And I think I just have a couple closing items. Again, if you're a CCA, please fill out the CEU credits. I think they'll be at a table over in the other room. And our next session will begin at 2 o'clock. So take your time to move there, get a bathroom break in between. Also, I was going to mention, if you're a grower or an advisor, we have a survey that we do annually called the Soybean Production Concern Survey. It has been on the TVs. There will be a QR code that will pop up. If you have the time to scan that and take it, it's really helpful for us to utilize that when we're trying to figure out what research to fund next. So you're hearing all about this ISA-funded research, and a lot of it comes from farmer input. So that's what we want it to be. It's farmer dollars, and we want it to fund research that farmers want. So please take the survey. That helps us a lot to know what you need. Or feel free to come talk to any of the staff as well. So thank you again to our panelists, and go ahead and take a break.
I do have one more announcement. There is food over there, more food. So if you want another snack, by all means, thank you.
guys usually hit that September.
Yeah, September 4th. I didn't know if you're not going to have anything at.
Okay. Yours is on. Y'all hear me? Okay, awesome. Well, thank you. Okay, breakout number 2. Thanks for joining us, everyone. This is the cover crop management one, so if you're in the wrong one. But hopefully this is going to be something new to learn here. My name is Abigail Peterson. I'm the Director of Agronomy here at ISA. Thank you for joining us here today. Thank you for joining us at the session. We are going to focus on cover crop management. I am thrilled to be joined by 2 of the most highly known experts that I know, Dan Schaefer and Jim Isermann. Before we jump in, hopefully everyone who has a CCA, you're getting your CEU credits here. That you can claim after the session. The sheet will be available for you to sign or do the QR code. And this session is live streamed, so for all of the great note-taking that you're doing, if you miss anything, you can rewatch it, or you can also share as well. We hope you share the links. And for any of the breakouts that you missed and want to watch, you can watch there too. So to introduce our panelist, Dan Schaefer is the Director of Nutrient Stewardship for the Illinois Fertilizer Chemical Association. Before joining IFCA in 2012, Dan spent 30 years in agricultural retail as an agronomist and plant manager for Eliana FS, working closely with growers to make enhanced yields through agronomic practices. He has also collaborated with the University of Illinois on-farm research to improve nutrient efficiency. Dan holds a Master of Science in Agronomy from the U of I. He's a certified professional agronomist, a certified crop advisor, and a 4R nutrient management specialist. Jim Isermann is an independent ag consultant specializing in conservation and soil health practices. He currently serves as a soil health specialist for the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership, supports Precision Conservation Management's 5-year soil health transition program, and collaborates with ISA, Illinois Soybean Association, on our on-farm trial network. So very highly qualified, and I wanted to kind of take over this panel selfishly for myself and utilize their time to focus on the common cover crop management issues that we see out in the fields all the time, what we get calls on, what we get pictures sent over text, what they want us to come out and look at. This is focusing on cover crop management. Now, I could make a whole presentation on conventional fields that also have problems. I am not highlighting just cover crops for fun, but I think from the panel this morning, the comment on better understanding the management tools for these for cover crops gives you a much better success rate and really gives you the opportunity to use cover crops to see the benefits instead of struggling with some of the problems that we've seen in the field. So I'm a very visual person, so I took the opportunity to highlight them. So I'm going to start with Dan. I picked 4 because we have limited time, and we could talk about a lot of different things. But I picked 4 issues. Dan's going to take 2. Jim's going to take 2. They'll talk throughout. But please ask questions. See if your fields have looked the same. And part of this is also, when you see the picture on the board, see if you can figure out what the problem is before we discuss it. Because the first problem is probably one of the most common ones we see. And it's usually a first-time cover cropper who has heard of cereal rye, and they're planting into corn. So from these issues, the first 3 slides here, we either see it at the beginning of the season when it's that first field. You saw, obviously, the yellow side-by-side of what the problem was. This is mid-year when we see tip back, we see firing in the lower canopy. And developmental issues with corn. So Dan, when you see this problem in the field, what is the problem that farmers don't consider when doing a cover crop before corn?
Can I go down there?
Yes, please.
First thing I'll tell you is coming from the ag retail back before 2012, I was probably a cover crop hater, and I was also somebody that would have promoted fall nitrogen applications and maybe put an extra 40 on. Through the NREC research grant that farmers pay into, I've followed the research and I've gone completely around. Now I see the benefits of the cover crops. We've got published papers on it from the research that's being done by NREC, and also we see the tile nitrate issues that are helped because of the cover crops and taking the nitrates out of the soil. So just to kind of preface where I'm coming from, a long time ago in 2010, 2011, Dr. Mark David and I would have and did butt heads on several of these subjects, and he was right. So with the amount of straw that's in this field, I think it looks to me like the cereal rye was fairly tall when they planted into it. I don't know whether it was planted green or not, but I suspect it was. It was terminated, and then the straw fell over. From the looks of that, and some of the research that we've done with NREC, with Lowell Gentry, we know that the corn plant has less biomass. So we did biomass sampling as we went through there, and it stunted the corn. Now, it could be an allelopathic problem, but we found that we want about a 2 or 3 week window of termination before we plant into cereal rye or a heavy residue grass, and it doesn't just have to be cereal rye, any grass that's got a lot of residue that's going to be falling apart or degrading. The other issue that we've learned to deal with is the amount of nitrogen to have up front when you're going into a high residue situation. And this can be corn on corn, where you've got a lot of corn stalks. It can be a cover crop situation. And adding, we found 60, 80 pounds of N at planting, whether you do it with the planter or you broadcast it, can offset some of this growth issue. Now, if you planted that green and the cereal rye was 2 foot tall when you planted into it, you're not going to make that back. You really need to terminate the cover crop earlier before planting corn. And this is a no-till. I think this is no-tilled. A lot of our research dealt with strip till within cereal rye with corn planting. That also helps. But we found out that we did 3 different termination dates. The first termination date, when the cereal rye was 6 inches tall, about a half ton of biomass, we didn't have an issue. The higher the biomass of the cereal rye, the more problems we had with the corn yield. And it was very telling. But one thing I will tell you, if you got high residue, get some nitrogen there up front. Don't wait to side dress it. Get as much, and the successful people I work with are running about 60 pounds with a planter treatment.
Am I supposed to point this somewhere? Okay, now this one's kind of hard to see with the screen, the glare, but I've gotten calls on, you're going out to the field and they start to see patterns. There's waves of light green, dark green, light green, dark green, right? Why are we seeing wave patterns of light green and dark green?
Is that corn on corn?
Yes.
Did they apply the nitrogen at an angle in the fall when it was wet?
It was applied, yes, anhydrous applied.
Okay, so that's what the green strips are. Would be anhydrous ammonia. You can't already see it. I've got really bad cataracts, so I can't even distinguish who's out there in front of me right now. But earlier I got to look at the slide, and I can see the green strips.
Yeah, so. It's unfortunately, I think the screens, but when you get the farmer call, you can see the light green, dark green pattern. And when you're an agronomist and you see a pattern, you start to think.
Yeah, nothing in nature is a square. It's going to be square or straight line. It's going to be something other than that.
And we talk about anhydrous.
Okay, so tell us what happened again with the anhydrous.
Oh.
I was trying to write it down.
Oh, they put it on at an angle, so you can see the strips at an angle.
Okay.
So then they probably applied it when it was a little bit wet in the fall or in the spring. It may have been in the spring. I don't know. I mean, it could have been in the spring. So what happens is that knife track, you smear the sides, and the ammonia sticks in there, and then it releases slower. And sometimes the corn plant will just pick up that strip of nitrogen, or burn the roots. And that's why they put it on an angle, so they could avoid burning the roots.
just the arrow. Okay, now this one you can see is a cover crop field. And it is, I need to go back a slide.
I like the slide prior to this one because that happened to us this year.
The previous slide, if you saw the cover crop, all the green that was in a perfect strip was water hemp. So that water hemp was growing in a perfect line, and then he had these every row. So why are we seeing this problem?
Strip till. We stripped, because we did that this past year, we strip tilled ahead of the corn, and we had an early warm spring, and the water hemp got started, and the only place it got started was in the strip, the row, because it was clean. Is that what happened here?
Yes, yeah, and he put, I think, anhydrous down, or some nutrients in the strip.
Oh, there is some nutrients in the strip.
It just kept it real healthy.
We didn't have any, we didn't have any nutrients in the strip other than some triple in ours, but the water hemp took advantage of the warmer berm before planting and took off and got going pretty good. And actually, we had a hard time killing it because it was above label on anything we could spray it with. And in that field, believe it or not, Eric Miller and myself and one of my granddaughters walked that cornfield when it was about knee high and took out some of the water hemp, some of the bigger stuff. It's the only thing that was left. Just one of the speakers earlier today said, hey, you reach a point where you can't do anything else with it except hoe it out. And that's what we did. So talking about nutrients being taken up by a cover crop, did you include that slide that I had where it had the planter in the field?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, on the next round with corn.
Next round, okay.
We'll talk about corn.
But yeah, that's a problem. You got to stay on top of that. And if you start seeing those strips turn green, you got to treat them pretty early. And I want to clarify one thing. I'm not a cover crop expert, but if I point to this guy right here, I know he is from Southern Illinois. And he's been working with cover crops for 30 years. Yeah, long time. He's not my age, but he's been working with them.
So final thoughts on just when you're doing nutrient management plans before cover crops, what would you consider as some of your key points?
If I'm planting corn into a cover crop, I'm probably going to use something that's less aggressive, like winter barley, something that doesn't grow fast like cereal rye. The other problem with planting cereal rye and putting on fall ammonia in a strip like that is the cereal rye will go after that nutrient, if it's MAP or DAP or whatever, and you speed up that growth. I like to use winter barley, and it doesn't seem to have the biomass that we get with that. Ahead of soybeans, I'm fine with cereal rye. It does a really good job. It helps out a lot on water hemp, and that's what I would probably use. And as you mature into your cover crop expertise, you can get later and later on planting into it. If you're starting out, I would stay, at that half ton to 3/4 of a ton biomass, which is about 6 to 8 inches, somewhere in that neighborhood. If you don't think you're doing anything with that small amount, we know you're pulling up a lot of nitrates, taking out a lot of nitrates out of the tile systems when you do that. But if you're planting corn and you've got a residue, get that nitrogen on up front, and then balance the rest of your nitrogen out through side dress. But that pre-plant application is very important. On soybeans, the nutrition is not as important, but be aware if you're spreading fertilizer, a lot of guys are spreading every acre every year. If you're spreading fertilizer ahead of your soybeans and you've got a cereal rye cover crop or another grass cover crop, they're going to pick up that nitrogen from that MAP or DAP and going to cause a lot faster growth, maybe more than what you're willing to accept.
Great. Any questions on nutrient management and cover crops? It's one of the considerations and things that sometimes don't get accounted for when making these plans, especially for what crop rotation you're in. If not, we'll move on to the next comment.
If you do have a question, though, let me come to you with a mic, please, so everyone can hear it. Thank you.
If not, and we can go back to these issues, as we round out the end. But The next common occurrence that we see is going to be what Jim's going to talk about. These are the two different fields for these first two slides, the same species of cover crop, the same type of cover crop. And so this is what this field looked like for management, and this was the second field. Now, there we go. This is the second field. So same cover crop. Do we know what the cover crop is? Do we know what the termination problem was? Go ahead, Jim.
So as far as, the cover crop, as we go through this, we're going to kind of identify a few different key points here. First one, what's the cover crop we're looking at? So she asked that, kind of breaking things up between what these ones are, which is annual ryegrass, and being able to terminate that, which is going to be some pretty specific conditions in order to make sure we're dealing with annual ryegrass. And then we can kind of look at our cereal cover crops, such as like cereal rye, barley, triticale, those ones that are far more popular as we move north. And then anytime we have some of these mixes that'll have either legumes, brassicas, some of those other things in there, we have to have actual considerations for that. So as we get started here, these first two problems are on annual ryegrass fields. I will say the best resource that I'm still using to date after 10 years of doing these types of talks is some bulletins that were put out from Purdue University quite a while ago. They still show up. They're the #1 thing if you Google it and just write in Purdue termination cover crops. They're going to be the first things that come up. One of them is just about cover crops in general, and one of them is specific about annual ryegrass. And so it's really important, and I will also kind of concede to, at least where I am geographically speaking, much farther north, I don't deal with annual ryegrass very often, but if you are going to terminate that, you really have to pay close attention to what you're doing and follow all the rules. The issues that I have as we move north is we can talk about these rules, we can talk about these best practices. The problem is sometimes you can do everything wrong and it can still work. If we're looking at something like cereal rye, barley, we have a little more wiggle room in order to make some mistakes as I talk about these different things. So we're talking about best management practices, and we want to give you strategies that are going to be effective 90 to 100% of the time. We don't want something that's only going to be effective 60 to 70% of the time. So keep in mind, if I'm standing up here and I'm going to say do this or don't do that, you say, oh, I've done that, and it's worked just fine, that happens a lot, especially as you get away from annual ryegrass to some of these other products that we can maybe not always follow the rules and it can work out, and we can kind of have those false successes. Looking at these particular fields, we're going to talk about this first one. We're going to talk about a big issue with tank mixes. Hopefully you guys, if you're involved with terminating cover crops either for yourself or for your customers, we know that we really have to watch the tank mixes that we put out there. We're usually relying very heavily on glyphosate for the actual termination, in particular for something like annual ryegrass. But if we add some of our other popular products out there, such as atrazine or metribuzin, we can actually cause some issues with that glyphosate working very well so that it doesn't do its job like we'd like to see and cause some problems. This particular field, had a lot of a very strong mix of chemicals with it. The farmer was trying to get ahead of things, keep his weed control in line. Obviously, this is also kind of going along the idea of what we're doing for best management practices for water hemp and weed control. We want those other modes of action, but we do need to be careful that if we're really trying to do our chemical terminations how they should be, we have to watch some of these chemical tank mixes on here. So this one had some atrazine, I believe, tank mixed in it, so that caused the problem. We also want to make sure that we're using the right product for the actual termination. So this is moving to some annual ryegrass that was terminated with gramoxone. And if you look at that, you may think it's going to have some pretty good kill, but it's going to come back. We don't use gramoxone up north very often, and it's not something that I really promote just because of some of its other issues with that. But I do know as you go farther south, it's a much more popular product and maybe something that we reach for, just given some of the other chemical resistances that we may want to use something like gramoxone. But at the end of the day, something like annual ryegrass has a very good root to it. That's why we want to use it for a cover crop, because it has phenomenal qualities for soil health. But we have to think about that annual ryegrass in the sense that we have a very small window above ground for that leaf structure that we need to get the chemical into to kill that root below ground. So something like gramoxone isn't going to translocate. So for sure, something like annual ryegrass, we want to use something like glyphosate that will translocate use it when the temperatures are appropriate, follow all those types of best guidelines. But this situation was something where the farmer used gramoxone, and he's probably going to have to come back with another application because that annual ryegrass is going to continue to grow after that.
Okay, this is another issue. Walking out into the field, see it burned, but it's not yet, obviously. Is this going to regrow? Is there something, is this going to cause issue to the cash crop?
So this is going to be another situation kind of going back to, Dan talked about making sure that we have plenty of upfront nitrogen. So as farmers, many of us are used to using 28 or 32% as part of our carriers for our nitrogen products. This can be a big problem when we start looking at cover crops. We really have to shift gears and have a different idea of what it is to terminate a cover crop versus just putting a typical burn down on a no-till or strip-till field. So when we apply that nitrogen with the glyphosate, basically what we have, we know that glyphosate needs to translocate. We just get leaf burn. We burn that leaf too quickly, and the glyphosate won't translocate. So sometimes, again, if we're looking at a cereal rye or barley crop, we have seen where this can be successful, and many farmers will report as long as they stay under about 10 gallons to the acre of 28 or 32, they can still have some success. But we definitely don't want to see any higher rates than that, and even at those lower amounts, we do just see not as good success rates with that, and it's definitely something we don't want to do with annual ryegrass. 100% stay away from it if annual ryegrass is in the mix, but a lot of farmers are still trying to go out and use those UAN carriers. We have a little bit of a concern if we have some of the other, just something like a gramoxone, it's going to burn the leaf as well, some of the other chemistries that may burn the leaf too quickly to allow the glyphosate to be taken up. I think we have another slide on this.
Yep, and then on the same lines, having to ask those questions to get to what caused this issue, seeing a field like this that has a similar tinge to that was cereal rye, but the issue in this one.
So these problems can also come a lot from just being sprayed way too early when the temperatures are too cool. We want to see temperatures starting to get up into the 50s. We don't want those bottom temperatures to be below 45 degrees Fahrenheit or so when we're starting to do these applications. Again, that kind of flies into contrast from even today. We've learned so much about wanting to plant beans earlier. That's where we're starting to have more struggles with these situations because we want to get that termination done. But we also want to get our beans out there. So we do see a lot more issues where farmers are wanting to get out there early to get the cover crop terminated. If we're going to do that, every once in a while we're going to see a failed application. We're going to have some problems with that. You're just going to have to balance that risk, whether getting it terminated and maybe risking having to come back with a later another rescue treatment is something you want to look at. But I will say, if you're going to be out there early, then you definitely want to make sure that you're not doing those tank mixes, that you're not using like a UAN, something like that. Like if you really feel that you need to go out early in the year and try to get an application, you're going to want to do it with just glyphosate. Let's avoid any of those other problems. And again, that may be kind of one of those scenarios where something like a gramoxone or a contact killer might make some more sense. Again, I'm not necessarily recommending doing that, but those aren't going to have the same issues with the temperature because they don't need that translocation. Another thing is always making sure that we're applying our glyphosate on a good cover crop as early in the day as possible so that we can give the glyphosate time to do its translocation job. We don't want to be spraying it close to sunset later in the day just because that plant's going to be shutting down. We want that glyphosate to get down into the root that day so it can get to work killing that plant.
Yeah, this one was sprayed at 7 p.m. This slide I just added as an agronomist walking out into fields, what happens if you don't get it sprayed. So this was, what happened was they didn't turn the sprayer on in this little, like I said, it's a perfect square.
Two places where some custom applicators aren't really excited about cover crops is with aerial applications and with determinations. Because if you're applying a chemical to just a no-till field and you miss a spot, it usually doesn't stand out that much. But if you're missing spots with a cover crop field, or if you're doing that application of cover crops with a plane, the farmers are starting to see, oh, wait a minute, sometimes we're missing some spots out there. So it definitely does show whether the row shutoffs are off a little bit. We'll always see fields like that in the springtime, or maybe there's an extra 10 feet where the row shutoffs weren't working right, but those problems do definitely show up. I think we have.
This is just that the previous slide. This is it grown out, so it didn't have an extra. It didn't get the kill. It was sprayed too cold. It's too late. But we didn't go out and spray again. We just let it go. And you can see, we got away with it. It definitely grew out, and that it actually headed out in the field. But we didn't have any issues as far as the soybeans were fine, and kind of went about our day. I will say, Jim, have you had problems with people who have had cover crops that don't get terminated, or maybe in an interseeding situation where they head out and it's an issue during harvest?
That can definitely be a problem, and I think to stress on this is, again, looking at the cereal rye, if it's a failed termination, is far less of a concern compared to if it's like an annual ryegrass. Because you'll see this crop has regrown, and lots of times what will happen with cereal rye, as long as we get it before flowering, it's not going to die as easily, but it'll often tiller back out. So we may have killed that top growth. And you'll see this is why farmers wait until anthesis or that flowering in order to do that roller crimping pass for termination, because if you do it earlier than that, you get this tillering out. So I think the important thing to notice is that is headed out, and those can actually produce viable seeds, which could be maybe a little bit of an issue if you're in an area with wheat and you don't want that voluntary rye coming in. So it is something to pay attention to, that cereal rye is photosensitive. It's going to be told by the day length whether or not to put a head out. So it doesn't necessarily have to get back to 5-6 foot tall to put that head out. But you can also see it's probably not going to grow back aggressively. Something like soybeans, it's not going to cause a problem. You may have a problem if you're looking at something like corn. Back to the annual ryegrass thing, always stress the guys, I would not be using annual ryegrass in a non-GMO corn system unless I really know what I'm doing, because there's no way to come back and deal with that annual ryegrass very well if it comes up in crop. So those are all considerations that we need to look at. And I don't know if we have any slides going beyond like the cereal rye or the annual ryegrass, but if you have anything else like a legume or a brassica or something in there, we really need to look at having like a 2,4-D product in there to get that termination done, because that glyphosate, particularly in the spring, might be fairly weak.
So this is the next example of when we're talking about termination. This is Find a Post, because that is our herbicide program at Peterson Farms. And then I added a little cutout of a common name brand. Matador was a product that guys were throwing out and using. And as a cover crop agronomist, seeing the active ingredients, what is a highlight for you on these, either the mixes or when you're talking about products that you want to?
Yeah, this can be another disconnect if you're not doing your own chemical applications. If you're hiring someone else to do it, you may not always be thinking through. You buy a product, Matador is a great example. You think, oh, I'm putting out Matador. Well, hopefully most farmers understand that you're actually putting out multiple chemistries when you're doing that. So when we say something earlier, I mentioned metribuzin, which is a fairly old chemical herbicide. It was originally, it's called Sancor as a product, and a lot of farmers may say, yeah, I used that back in the 80s, 90s, whatever it is, but we're not using that anymore. It shows up in a lot of tank mixes. So farmers need to be aware of that they may say, well, I'm not too worried about that. I don't use that product. Make sure you're looking at these tank mixes that may be labeled as one product, such as Matador. It's really a host of different products in there. We want to make sure what's in there. So making sure we're watching out for that atrazine, that metribuzin, and mesotrione's another one that sometimes comes up as an issue, but we don't see that used in burn downs near as much. So making sure that you're reviewing your products, make sure you're looking at those labels and you're abiding by them for tank mixing instructions and plant packs and all that.
I want to say, any last key points with termination?
Yeah, making sure you're identifying the species. I lump them out between annual ryegrass, those cereals, and then whether it's a legume or a brassica. Annual ryegrass, you got to do everything right. Cereals, you're looking at glyphosate, spray it properly. If you have those legumes or brassicas, make sure that you're throwing in something like a 2,4-D product for the burn down. Make sure the temperatures are warmed up. Watch those tank mixes, and hopefully everybody can be more successful and we can have fewer issues with termination products or with termination of cover crops, as was kind of mentioned earlier as a downside. Okay.
Any termination questions want to be thrown out? All right.
Oh,
Yeah.
hold on one second.
Thank you. Could you go back to what you were saying about early soybeans and I get this, the issue is that you're wanting to plant early, but you got this cover crop out there. How do you go back over that as far as how to address that time, that crunch in there?
Well, I would certainly say that's kind of something that a lot of guys are still trying to figure out. So the best case scenario, if we're wanting to plant our soybeans in, early April, sometimes late March, we still got our cover crop going. Usually we don't have very good conditions for spraying. We usually don't have much growth on our cover crop, so a farmer may be looking at it and saying, well, I don't want to necessarily terminate this early anyway. So as far as dealing with that is if I felt that I had to get out there and get my cover crop on, I'm really going to make sure that I'm just going out there with glyphosate. I'm going to be trying to give it the best chance I can, making sure I'm avoiding any of the issues with tank mixes or a nitrogen carrier. Some farmers are planting their beans and waiting a little bit later to terminate. There can be some value in that from a weed control perspective, even from an insect perspective. I will say I have not seen that carry to a positive yield result. We can see it without any negative yield necessarily, but we do run a risk then of getting rained out later if we want to come back and do the termination, and we can end up with some more biomass out there than we want. So it is a challenge. Honestly, the answers for cover crop, I've been talking about this more often. We have a different problem than we did 10 years ago because we're not planting our beans in the middle of May like we used to. We're planting them much earlier. It's completely kind of changed how we need to manage some of our cover crops, particularly cereal rye and these cereal cover crops that used to be kind of more that no-brainer that guys used to say, oh yeah, we're always seeing these positives out of it. Because we're wanting to plant our beans so much earlier all the time, that's kind of making it a little bit different and a little more difficult on the management side of things. So does that answer? Yes. Yeah. There's a table behind me.
Okay. Dan's up next. So the next segment, so we went through nutrient management, went through termination. Now we're evolving a little bit into farmers wanting to do things before corn. So you'll notice here in this field, this is a termination that was at 2 inches of growth, not too bad, of what that corn is looking like.
Is that conventional till next to it?
Yes, conventional till next to it. Oh, I think I skipped one, but going to the next one, Dan, when we talk about biomass before corn, and what we want biomass to look like, I feel like you talk to a lot of crowds and you're talking about knee high or when it gets to 6 foot tall. So here we have when it's about 12 inches to 6 feet tall. Dan, how do you manage biomass in front of your corn crop and what type of species are you picking out and things like that? I've got your next slides of barley after this.
So that back to that first slide. So there was very little biomass. And what was the cover crop? Do you know?
That was cereal rye.
Cereal rye. So is that a possible allelopathic response? I don't know. It was no-tilled in there apparently. The ground just may have warmed up slower. There again, maybe a touch of starter with the corn, maybe some additional nitrogen at planting may have offset some of that. I haven't seen that problem with what we've been working with, and mainly because we use strip till. That's our transition from tillage to no-till to use of cover crops is using that strip to warm things up in the spring. And if you know the nitrogen cycle, that increases mineralization. And I should have brought this up when I was talking about the heavy residue. Immobilization is what your cereal rye is doing. As that cereal rye grows and gets taller and it lays on the ground and the roots are in the ground, you've got an immobilization of available nitrogen. So somehow you got to offset that. So at 15 to 1, you're probably net mineralization. At 30 to 1, your net immobilization. So it flips on you. When you immobilize that nitrogen, it's not available to the plant. So the taller you get the biomass, or the taller you get to the plant, the more plant product you've got to break down. This plant here probably has about 2.5 to maybe not quite 3% nitrogen. It's going to break down quicker. The tissue is more dissolvable by the microbes. This one is stemmed, it's jointed, it's probably got about 1% nitrogen in it. When it goes on the ground, it's going to lay there and not break down for a while. And that's where we get into some of our problems. That's probably a foot tall cereal rye there. That's about the maximum we normally terminate ahead of corn. Ahead of soybeans, depending on what the situation is in the spring. We're wanting to plant earlier too. If we don't have strips in there, we will plant and then terminate green. Now, what's the caveat there is I'm not dependent on somebody to come in and take care of that termination for us. We have a gator with a 60-foot boom and a sprayer that we use, and we can spray 160 acres in a day's time, and we can do our termination when we need to terminate. We learned a very valuable lesson one year where we planted green and we had 2 weeks of rain. The beans came up, the cereal rye kept growing, and it was growing good. It was beginning to head out, and we couldn't get ground equipment in there other than a smaller gator. At that point in time, we made a decision to make sure we had the equipment ready to do that. So there's those trade-offs from when you start looking at how are you going to terminate, a taller plant. The modern planters can plant in about anything. I mean, we can plant into no-till, and actually, I'll tell you a secret. If you go from strip till for 5 or 6 years and you're using cover crops and you're in the rotation with corn and soybeans, you're going to be able to no-till. The problems we had back in the 80s when we started no-tilling in this Drummer Flanagan around Champaign County was the ground would dry out and would split open. If you're coming out of tillage, give that about 10 years and you will transition that farm. And John's probably seen the same thing. Seen it in Piatt County, exactly, the same soil. Right. So we come out with the Maximum Merge planters. We thought, we're going to no-till all this bean stubble. And what happened was those seed furrows dried out and they cracked open. And you could actually see the seed down in the furrow. But if you transition away from that tillage and feed the cover crops into the system, you can get away from any tillage at all, even strip till.
So, here's a mix that was used before corn. Something stands out other than cereal rye in that mix. And so as an agronomist in the crowd, as someone who is using, what is this cover crop that you're seeing maybe used more in front of corn? It's your barley. And so, Dan, your 3 photos are here after this one. So.
Go up to the barley one. We'll go back to this one.
One more.
Go up. You're going backwards. There. Okay, so these are the fall strips, winter barley. This is in a research field, of course, but we find that the winter barley it spreads a little bit, but it doesn't get extremely tall. So then we can hit it with Roundup, and you can do a really nice job with terminating that. And then we've got our tilled strips from the strip till that we can plant into. And we could have planted that green if we wanted to and wouldn't have had any issues at all with the winter barley. Okay, go ahead and back up. That's the hood of the gator. So this was the Illinois Soybean Association project that I did. It was 2 years ago on this one, and it was in spring of 23 when I took that photo. We was getting ready to plant the beans, and I noticed a difference between the treatments. Well, the only difference in treatments were this was 30-inch rows where it's green with fertilizer in the strip. I had encapsulated nitrogen source, not very much nitrogen. I had MESC, which is a ammoniated phosphate in the strip. The light green had no fertilizer. So what happens is the cereal rye, and this was cereal rye because we was going to plant beans, has a real affinity to nitrogen. It just loves nitrogen. That's why we like it in a field after corn ahead of soybeans, is it picks up all, it scavenges all that extra nitrogen. Well, we had a really good corn yield the year before, so there wasn't much to scavenge until we fed it with our treatments, our fertility treatments ahead of that Soybean Association project. And as you can see, the cereal rye is doing really well. This cereal rye was about a ½ ton biomass. This was about a ¼ ton biomass. That had approximately 3% nitrogen in it when we terminated, and approximately not quite 30 pounds of N. And the other part had about 12 to 15 pounds of N. So that's what was scavenged from that field and kept out of the tiles. But my point is, I can't tell you when those nutrients are going to come back. So like in corn, if that was going to corn and the cereal rye had grabbed that nitrogen from a fall application, I can't tell you when that anhydrous, that ammonia that was picked up as nitrate is going to come back. We hope that it's within that growing season and early enough to benefit the corn crop. And in this case, I would hope it was early enough to benefit my soybean trial. I can tell you the results of that real quick. The untreated 15-inch rows out-yielded the expensive treated 30-inch rows and strips by quite a bit. There was no advantage to any fertilizer. Kind of goes along with what Bilo said. In a early planted situation, and that was early planted, it was sometime in April, the fertility did not add to the yield. Last year, we did a similar project. It was late planted. It was May 30th when we got the beans planted, and the treated, where the fertility treatments was, we had a yield increase. So, but anyway, I guess the main point of this is your cover crop can take up your nutrients that your corn was going to use. Same thing with water hemp, henbit. All that can take up nutrients that your corn's going to need, and you don't know when you're going to get it back. Do you know when we'd get that back, John? I mean, you've done a lot of studies.
It depends on the growth stage. If you're killing, it depends on the growth stage. If you're terminating any type, your cereal rye or barley, annual ryegrass, when you're dealing with the vegetative stage and it's a grass blade and doesn't have any joining to it, that type of biomass is going to melt back in to the system fairly quick and within the season most of the time. The problem of it is when you get into the joining and where the shovel is, both of the rye at both of the stages there is to the joining stage, so there is lignin forming in that straw structure there, and that is the tightly held nutrients. Anything in that is going to take a while to decompose. And even in the far left one there, that Dan said it was the biggest that they would terminate. And you know, in this region, unless you were in a strip till environment or something, I would want to take it out earlier than that, unless I was in a system to where I had a comfort with doing that. But I think the most important thing with something like this is that we need to find ways to make it work in the short term for the entry-level grower.
Right.
And in the case of corn, earliest termination possible is going to be the key. And in this area, with the availability of strip till equipment, I wouldn't plant corn into a solid seeded cover crop environment at all if it was the first couple years in. My introductory in, I want to do a good job of establishing a cover crop at a relatively light seeding rate. I want to terminate it early, and I want to pair that with cover crops, and that would meet a lot of our nutrient management and nitrate sequestration goals, and it would grow a darn good corn crop and eliminate a lot of this garbage that we've talked about, you know, in this and other sessions about the stumbling blocks, because to let it get any bigger than what was with that ruler right there is going to cause more problems, more years than it's worth in this region and north.
Yeah. Thanks, John. One other thing before I give up the floor here. We ran into a problem one year where a conventional guy, trying to do the right thing, put a cover crop out in the fall of the year, and then went in, he sprayed it with Roundup, but then he tilled it while it was still green. And we had an insect problem, and I think it was seed corn maggot, I think, came into that or something. It laid their eggs and stuff in there. So don't incorporate a cover crop in the spring of the year ahead of planting. You can have some issues there.
All right, the next problem. We're, like I said, there's a lot that you can focus on with these management issues.
Am I taking too much time?
No, you're good. I mean, I wish we could have more time. But I do want to get to the last, Jim's going to cover some common issues that we see in what has been talked about. We talked about, species before different crops, the nutrient management issues, the termination timing, why the biomass stage is very important, but then how can application methods influence and be a tool in that scenario. So going out to this field, this farmer was upset with the application. So Jim, you want to talk about maybe what this application had a problem with?
Yeah, so that is, when it comes to applications, this is going to be one of the biggest things that we need to figure out how to do in order to get cover crops established. There's a lot of farmers that are interested in adopting these practices, but they just don't have the time in the fall. We're trying to find ways to get them out there quickly, get across the acres. So this is a big deal because it's not just a money thing. Sometimes they think, well, we're just going to give you the $20 or whatever to get it established. You ought to be able to find somebody to do it. So I'm not necessarily a purist when it comes to application methods. It's whatever's going to get the job done. We definitely need to tailor it to our goals and make sure that we're, if we're going for weed control, we're probably going to have to use a drill. If we're looking for certain species like legumes, we might have to do an aerial application. But we do see a lot of farmers trying to go the route of maybe they're still transitioning from that tillage side of things, so they might still like to do a little bit of tillage, makes them a little more comfortable, and they're looking for fast ways to get the cover crops on. So what we have here is a farmer putting I'm not sure if this was actually mounted to a vertical tillage tool or if it was broadcast ahead of vertical tillage. They're both the same idea, but we're essentially doing a broadcast application of a cover crop, then coming through with a vertical tillage tool for incorporation, which can be a great way to get a cover crop established. However, we do need to make sure that we're getting out and double checking how deep we're actually going. Oftentimes farmers may think that we're going a certain depth, but if you actually went out and measure what that is, you very likely are going a little bit deeper than you think, and you're going to have to tailor that also to the species of cover crops. So this is just a situation where we just had the seed was just buried way too deep. Somebody had their tillage tool set a little aggressively, even though I think this is cereal rye, correct, which can handle a fairly deep depth when it comes to seeding. It's one of the ones that's going to be able to handle going sometimes up to 2 inches deep or maybe even a little more than that. We're usually looking more around that 1 inch depth. It's kind of similar to wheat. So yeah, just a situation of not having the equipment adjusted right in that scenario and just getting some of that seed buried too deep. And again, some of those other species may not even be able to go that deep. So
go ahead and skip to this one. This is a common establishment in an application method. I'm sure if you can guess it. It is aerial. So what kind of concepts do you want to talk about when we're thinking about aerial seeding?
Aerial seeding, I think the biggest thing is we just have to change our expectation for what success is. People do an aerial application, or whether maybe it's a high clearance seeder or a broadcast application, and it is not going to be a picket fence stand. The reason that we want to do an aerial application is so that we can introduce different species besides cereal rye, and so that we can get better root growth. So that's the biggest thing, is getting out to a field. If you've done an aerial application, walk the field, dig up the roots, see that additional root growth that you're getting. That's what you're looking for on the benefits of these aerial applications. And being allowed then maybe to get a legume in there to be able to get those brassicas in there. So the biggest thing is aerial applications can be successful, we have to change our attitude of what success looks like in that situation. Again, you're not going to get a picket fence stand, so if you're looking to really cut by herbicide budget, by weed control, you're not necessarily probably going to get that out of an aerial application, although we can get very good establishment. I mean, those situations may happen, but not as reliable as using something like a drill. So making sure we're tailoring our application method to what our goals are. I think a lot of people are down on aerial applications, and it isn't always going to be successful. You're going to have those years where it doesn't work, but that's just part of the game. You're making that trade-off in order to get better root growth and those different species in there. Yes?
Like you said, that's very different from what historically, that's very different from what I've been taught from getting the most bang for your buck out of cover crops as far as aerial applications.
Yeah, and I do want to stress, it takes a little experience to know when to do it. I think one of our biggest problems is we do them when we shouldn't. Not every year is going to be ideal for an aerial application. We need moisture. I mean, you can't put it out there and let it sit for 6 weeks till we get a rain. So it has to be done ahead of a rain. It has to be done when the crop canopies and everything are receptive for it. I don't know that I'll necessarily dive into that right now. So you do have to set yourself up. It isn't going to work perfect every year. Like I say, it's a trade-off. You're trading that picket fence stand, you're trading that 100% reliability off for better roots, deeper roots, different species besides just cereal rye. So it is something a lot of people have gotten very much against aerial applications, and I understand why. And there's a lot more we could go into that on like how to get it done successfully. But I do see fields all the time. They say this was a failure, and I'm like, this is a great looking stand for aerial application. If you work with farmers, get the farmers out there, walk the field, dig the crops up with a spade, show them where the roots are, compared to a cereal rye root planted in late November that has a little 1-inch taproot. You can get out there and you can dig those roots up and see now by late November I've got a foot of a root on there or something like that. So it's a trade-off for what we're looking for.
You're going to have to go speed round. So the next photo, if you want to talk about just...
I think Dan he kind of hit on this with the strip till, and John talking that too, up about making sure that particularly in a corn situation, not having that solid seeded stand. Maybe even soybeans, this might be worthwhile, but this is just essentially a drill that had a row plugged up so that we have an open area to be able to get out there and plant our cash crop in that doesn't have that direct competition. Strip tillage, again, can be applied. We see a lot of 15-inch row planters being used, particularly in something like strip till, so that we're not wasting seed. You could do like a broadcast application and then go out and do the strip till, but you're going to tear up some of that seed that's out there. So some farmers will like to do either 15-inch row or a skip row, just anything to be able to get that row, particularly with corn, so that we don't have those negative interactions.
Yeah, 15-inch row, 30-inch row, really focusing on, where we're placing it.
Making sure if you're going to go to all the effort of this that you're actually planting in between the row. We have RTK, we have a lot of technology. We just need to make sure that we're using it properly so that we're not ending up planting right down the row, because that can be kind of a failure.
We did a good job setting up the rows, but then we planted directly on top of them. So different issues there. So yeah, lots within application. I mean, this is some interseeding that you see up more north, Jim. But to round out, some final thoughts on applications.
Yeah, just whatever's going to work for you. I tell the story. I got a neighbor. He just does a broadcast application. Sometimes he'll hit it with a roller. I used to have a little 15-foot tie drill. My stand looked a heck of a lot better, but it would take me, 8 hours to get an 80-acre field done. He'd show up at the field next to me. Hour and a half, he's got 80 acres done. He's moved on. He gets all his crop applied pretty darn quickly. He can get his cover crop on in a day or two. Is it as picture perfect as mine? No, but he gets the job done. He gets the acres on. And if our goals are the environmental aspects, particularly with nitrates, he's getting a lot of success out of that. So do what works for you. Do what's going to let you get the job done.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Overall, cover crop management is something, you need to be asking questions. There's not something that we haven't seen, but done right, it can be a success. I really wanted to utilize their time to understand some of the concepts. A lot of them could have been dug into deeper, so I encourage you to check out Field Advisor and look into, we have research ongoing right now into these management practices, what differences can occur when we're looking at different, what Dan's doing with his check off funded money, what you've got with nutrient management, Jim with the on-farm trials that he does. It's all about just getting on your fields and your scenarios with your rotations and what the spring or the fall encounters and figuring it out. So please continue asking these questions, giving us your issues, and we'll figure these things out and make sure that the cover crops are the tool that wins. Appreciate your time. Thank our panelists up here today.
Thanks.
You can get going. You got one more panel. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, I'm mic'd, yes. So we're going to get started here. Welcome to the final panel breakout here at Field Advisor Forum. I'm Stephanie Porter, and I'm the outreach agronomist with the Illinois Soybean Association. Thank you so much again for joining us today. Our discussion, obviously, as you can see on your agendas, is on soybean cyst nematode management. And I'm very excited to be joined by two panelists, Dr. Nathan Schroeder and Dr. Matthew Hudson. We were also supposed to be joined with Dr. Jason Bond. Today, he unfortunately has lost his mother, so he was unable to join us today, but we send our deepest sympathy to him. Some quick housekeeping notes. If you're a certified crop advisor, please sign the sheet available in the room to claim your CEU credits after the session. This session will be live streamed on Field Advisor YouTube channel, so feel free to share the link with anybody who might want to join us remotely. And now we'll just get to it. How about I introduce our panelists? Dr. Matthew Hudson is a professor of crop sciences at the University of Illinois with affiliations across multiple research centers, including the Center for Digital Agriculture, the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, and the Institute for Genomic Biology. His work focuses on applying digital and genomic technologies to crop science, with a special emphasis on discovering mechanisms for SCN resistance in soybean and strategies to address SCN virulence. Dr. Nathan Schroeder is an associate professor of nematology in the Department of Crop Sciences at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Over the past decade, Dr. Schroeder has been a key faculty member at UIUC, teaching plant pathology and conducting research on nematodes. His work includes both fundamental studies to better understand nematode biology and applied research aimed at developing effective control strategies for plant parasitic nematodes. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hudson and Dr. Schroeder. So first off, I don't want everyone to assume, but we are funding, or I should say ISA is funding projects with both of these individuals. So I'm going to go ahead and let them share with you, just an overview of what kind of research that they're working on. And any kind of, if you want to go through your slides, that's fine too. We'll just go with the flow here. Okay. How about that?
Sounds good.
And the questions will kind of go, I think, after you guys share some of your information. And one thing I want to point out, because I think it's super cool, is, and I want you to elaborate on more, Matt, on this, but one of our board members actually initiated the project that you're working on.
Yeah.
Correct.
And
So go ahead.
I'll talk a little bit more about that in my slides.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
I'll let Nate go first, but I think it's really great to have this kind of engagement, and it's really it's surprising to me that actually the ideas coming out of the Illinois Soybean Association are more forward-looking than we're getting from the federal government and other places. So that's really exciting.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, so for the past year or so, over a year now, we've been conducting free testing for SCN for Illinois growers, so funded through ISA. The samples come in, they're processed by our plant clinic here at the University of Illinois for number of eggs per 100 cubic centimeters of soil, and that's sort of a standard metric. And so this first slide is showing the results there, the number of positive samples per county, so it's somewhat color-coded, red being sort of the highest average counts. Gray indicates we have no data from those counties, so if you're in one of those counties, please contribute. And I think the take-home message from this is one that probably many people are familiar with, is that SCN is here. We have it in Illinois. And then the other one is that it's very patchily distributed, which we see both at a field scale as well as a statewide scale, that we can't just predict, oh, SCN will be there and it won't be there. So we get very, very high numbers in some fields. And even for some farms, we had one farmer who submitted 4 samples. In 2 samples, we had zeros. In 1 sample, we had about 320 eggs. And in the 4th sample, we had over 30,000 eggs per 100 cubic centimeters. So huge variation in distribution. So lots of data suggesting SCN is here. It's problematic. We are doing actually a pretty good job. So the highest number we got was about 48,000 eggs per 100 cubic centimeters, but about 20% of our samples were zeros. So we are doing a good job controlling it. Matt is going to talk more about the mechanisms of resistance, but I did want to share one slide, which was a survey. So Matt will probably talk more. I was told to point this at the computer. There we go. So one of the main mechanisms for control or control strategies is plant disease resistance. And the issue that we face, and Eliana talked about it earlier in her talk, is that we've been using the same source of control for the past 30 years, which is a source of resistance called PI 88788. And I did a survey of about 15 companies, 650 varieties, from maturities group 2 to 4.9, and about 90% of them have that 88788 form of resistance. So there are Peking forms of resistance, which is a different form of resistance, and again, Matt will talk more about that. Surprisingly to me, there were some susceptible varieties out there still on the market, which is unexpected. And really, there's very few, only 3 varieties outside of 88788 or Peking that were resistant. And actually, I believe, Eliana, those came from the Baird seeds. And I believe they were non-GMO varieties. So, and then the other issue to note is if you're planting in southern Illinois, no Peking varieties for maturity groups 4 and up. So with that, I'm going to just pass the torch on to Matt, and he can talk about some of his work.
Thanks, Nate. So I was going to talk about a lot of these things. I'll touch on them, but I was asked to specifically talk about the Illinois Soybean Association project, which is new. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but I'll just introduce what I'm going to say. So I don't know if I
think you have to get closer.
Okay, yeah, I might need to stand up over here. There we go. That's not the first slide. Okay. So I want to talk about control strategies for cyst nematode. And as Nate mentioned, we've basically got one that really works, which is resistance genes in the plant, right? So that's been our mainstay to keep the nematodes down, that and rotation. So and we have good evidence of this from our North Central project that I think was what Nate was referring to. If you grow the same soybean varieties with the same resistance source year over year over year, you're going to see the nematodes adapt to that. And we are looking and figuring out why they adapt to it, why they adapt to some types of resistance more quickly than others. And we've had a good run with this PI 88788, but it seems to be coming to an end. So it's not working as well as it used to in Illinois. Most of the samples we get seem to be able to overcome that type of resistance now. We've got these other varieties, these Peking type varieties, but they're not as high yielding. They're usually not available in like the latest herbicide resistant technology and things like that. So there's reasons people don't want to grow that Peking type varieties or these other resistance type varieties. What other alternatives have we got? Well, there's nematicides. We've kind of been around that one a few times. The companies have tried that. They've also got a mixed record. The resistance in the plant tends to work better. They tend to be toxic. They're bad for the environment. Some of them work okay as a seed treatment, but mixed results with nematicides that target nematodes directly. We've got a USB project that looks into enhancing the plant's resistance chemically. So can we add chemicals to the mix as well as the genetics to make our resistance last longer, make it work better? But what the new ISA project is, which came out of farmer input, is, well, why don't we think outside the box a little bit and look at some of these new technologies that have come along that might allow us to actually target the nematodes using biological methods rather than chemical methods. And the idea there is, the original thought was there's this technology called a gene drive. And the idea behind a gene drive is we have this gene editing technology now, CRISPR, and the gene editing technology is itself a gene. So you have a gene that can hop out of the place that it's in effectively as an RNA, and it can go and edit other places in the genome. And it turns out it can also edit other genomes in a cross. So this has been mostly thought of as a way to target insect pests like flies and mosquitoes that cause disease. The idea is that you take a gene, you put it into some flies, usually male flies. They're going to go breed with a bunch of female flies or female mosquitoes. The offspring, that gene edit is going to activate, and it's going to copy itself into both genomes. So then all of the offspring from that cross will all have the gene drive. And then their offspring will all have the gene drive. So the gene drive duplicates itself through the whole population. It spreads very quickly. And it can then deliver either a gene that causes usually the flies to be infertile, so they then can't breed. So that'll knock down the population massively, possibly even causing that fly to become extinct is the idea. So if something like an Anopheles mosquito that carries malaria, people wouldn't be too upset if that got extinct, right? And the other possibility is you can put something in there that specifically targets it, makes it susceptible to some kind of other thing like a chemical intervention. The problem with this technology, there's a few issues with it, but the main one is you have to keep that gene drive down while you're actually breeding the flies before you can release them. So you somehow have to make lots of flies to release. You can't do that if they're infertile. And the other problem is that because it's designed to spread, it's designed to spread through the population, it's designed to edit genomes, people are a bit nervous about that, right? We don't know how far it's going to spread. Could it spread to other species? Could it spread to like birds that eat the mosquitoes? And maybe it could spread in a way that actually made the mosquitoes more resistant to pesticides because it's designed to mutate them. Maybe it could have an unintended consequence that actually was opposite to what we intend. So there's a lot of risks with it, and for that reason, it's not actually been approved for any kind of release anywhere in the world yet. There is another technology which this company from Britain, Oxitec, came up with, which is similar, but it doesn't have that spreading aspect. So what they do is, again, with mosquitoes is the original target for this, but they're targeting more insects, and it could work in nematodes. You have a protein that basically causes a gene that the mosquito really needs to produce, and it knocks that gene down so that they can't reproduce anymore. And it does that via another gene. It doesn't spread, but that gene goes in through the male line. So you have to breed a lot of male mosquitoes with this gene. And there is an antibiotic that you can give the flies that stops that gene being expressed. So you grow the flies on antibiotics, rear lots of them, release them, and then those males will mate with females. Their offspring won't be viable. So, and this actually has been shown to work really well, and it's actually getting quite widely used in Africa as a way of controlling mosquitoes. So there's some technical challenges with getting this to work in worms. One of them is our gene insertion, the transgenic technology where you can put transgenes into the nematodes is not very good. And doing that stably in male nematodes is not very easy. Also, you can rear these flies on bananas, right? You just pulp up some bananas or the mosquitoes you have to use, I think they use pig blood or cow blood. We have to use soybean roots. So you have to grow an awful lot of soybean roots to make enough male nematodes to have an effect on the population. So we're working on solutions to that, but there's a lot of hundreds of millions of dollars of science gone into the malaria mosquitoes. We're just at the beginning of that, but I think it's a good place to invest, right? Because we know that the time we've got left with these resistant varieties, with the other things we're doing, is limited, and we're already starting to see problems, especially if you grow, if you try and grow continuous soy, or you don't rotate, you're going to see problems very quickly.
Okay, thank you. So I guess you kind of covered a lot there. You shared about your research. I think one of the hot topics, or several questions that I've been asked throughout the season, and I've usually tried to talk with the researcher and get questions answered the best way we can. So if you have any questions on soybean cyst nematode, we can work through those throughout the season. I can easily email, for example, you and get some quick question or answers to the questions. So one of the questions or hot topics is definitely peaking. And for example, I know there's been farmers tell me that they've seen as much, or I read, as much as a 20 bushel yield bump with peaking. And do you guys want to comment on that? I know you gave a little background on peaking, but this is what some farmers are actually experiencing right now.
Yeah, so a lot of this is anecdotal. So the peaking bump is a big change from olden days when there was a peaking lag, where people didn't want to grow peaking because of this yield lag. And I think it does go to show what Matt was talking about, that the nematode is starting to adapt to the 88788 form of resistance. And so having that additional control strategy there, which really can knock down those nematodes that are adapted to 88788, is a good way to go. Again, the number of varieties out there for farmers, though, is limited.
How quickly can the nematode become adapted, or how quickly will peaking last?
I can take that one if you like, because we've done an experiment in another project on that one where we grew continuous soy in different plots. And we looked at peaking resistance, 88788, and a couple of newer exotic ones. And actually, 88788 is one of the most durable, but it's also one of the weakest forms of resistance. And then peaking's quite a bit stronger, but we did see a strong increase in virulence over a 6-year period. And then some of the newer ones, which are stronger, they get overcome more quickly. And what helps you sustain that is if you rotate the different resistance sources. So even if you're growing continuous soy, if you can go 88788 peaking, 88788 peaking, that's actually very durable in this experiment. So even if you're growing continuous soy, you can rotate your resistance, rotate your varieties, you'll get a better result. The other thing I'd like to say is I think the reason people are seeing this peaking yield bump is it's not really a yield bump. What it is the loss we're seeing that is slowly creeping in from these nematodes that are getting more and more virulent on the resistance source that we're all using. It's kind of like a zombie movie. They're slow moving, and there's more and more of them all the time, but you don't notice.
I'm going to have nightmares.
They creep up on you, right?
Yeah.
And I think the problem is that the companies have done a great job boosting yield. And just, if you look at corn, people are used to getting bigger and bigger and bigger yields every year with the new varieties. They're actually doing that in soybean, but you're not seeing it because the nematodes are eating away that extra yield from these new varieties. So when you put the newer varieties and you introgress those old resistance genes, it's not peaking, but it's a few genes from peaking like RHG4 and RHG1A, then you see this massive yield bump because suddenly the nematodes can't grow on that germplasm. So I do think there's, people are missing out on yield they could have. But yeah, as far as I know, you can't buy enlist soybeans that are peaking type resistance or something like that. So most of them are public varieties, most of them are non-transgenic. So unless you're growing organic or something like that, there's a lot of reasons people want to grow enlist, right?
Right. Oh, yeah. weed control, for sure. Next up, one of the other common questions that I get is having to do with nematode testing. And I know we've worked out a lot of kinks with that system as well. And I'm very grateful for you for working with us. And we talk about, certain things. I know there's people in this room actually that have done the nematode testing. So they may have some questions or comments too. But I appreciate you working with us to make the program better each year. And one of the common questions that I get is thresholds.
Yeah, and this is a question that I get a lot, and it's one that I kind of look down at my shoes at and mumble away something. So thresholds is something that nematologists don't feel comfortable with. And part of the reason is that it's a complicated system. When we take a soil sample, or you take a soil sample, you're taking it from one small area of the field. You could move over a foot, and you might get a very different result. So we're getting an idea of the populations there. That's one issue that causes uncertainty. The other area is that, and if you've taken plant pathology, Lauren, I know you took plant pathology, you remember the disease triangle. I'm sure you took it with me.
You'll be quizzed later, Lauren.
So the disease triangle has the pathogen, the host, and the environment. And so the environment plays a role in terms of, okay, how bad will a certain level of the pathogen be towards your host under that environment? So if you have great fertility, you're keeping weeds down, you get plentiful moisture, you may have a higher level of SCN and not see as much of a yield loss. At some point, a number of eggs, yes, we're pretty confident you're gonna get yield loss. So if we start seeing numbers above 10,000 eggs per 100 cubic centimeters, I can feel pretty confident, even if you have a good crop, you're probably gonna get some yield loss. But it's really, really variable. And so that's why we don't usually talk about strict thresholds. I mean, I kind of think of it akin to, you go to your doctors and you get your cholesterol tested, right? And you get a number. Well, what does that number mean? Well, it's going to depend on, okay, do you smoke? Did your parents have heart disease? Do you exercise? What kind of food do you eat? And all those things can go into it, and they can affect how you interpret that number. Do you have to go on a statin or not? Okay? It's the same sort of thing. We can give you a number. We've got a general idea that's bad or that's really good, and it's in those middle areas where we can give you an idea and we can help you interpret, but it's not black and white.
Okay, thank you. Lastly, I'll take it back to you. Why should ISA keep funding your project for SCN testing?
Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable question. So I think that, again, I'll use my cholesterol analogy. It's like, I cannot take a look at any of you and predict what your cholesterol levels are, right? You have to take the test to know it. You can't predict it. You might know, well, I ate a bunch of those hot dogs over there today, and so my cholesterol probably went up. But you need that number. Right? Without it, you don't know sort of what risk you're at for long-term health effects. The same thing is true. We can't look at a field and we can't say, looking at the soybean above ground, oh, you've got an SCN problem. We can say, oh, you've got kind of a weak stand. We can look at yield numbers, but then correlating that back to SCN without getting those egg counts is impossible. Right? And so really, I think the service is for those growers to be able to say, look, this is what I have. Whatever I'm doing is controlling it well. I got a 0, great. Well, okay, I got a 10,000. I need to sort of think maybe I'll do a couple of years of corn. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that in an ISA conference or not, but I think it's really for the growers to get an idea of how to interpret their fields and what they're seeing and what they should think about.
So one particular situation, and I just thought of another question for you before we go to the audience. My mind is going now. But let's say this has actually happened to me. I do a field visit. I'm the agronomist on the scene. I'm CSI. I'm trying to figure things out. I have a list of questions like a doctor. And one of my questions usually is always, have you done an SCN test lately? And the answer usually is yes. And this really happened. Great farmer. And he said, yes, I was one of the first ones that they found SCN in Illinois. And he was very proud of it when I've heard the story about the extension service, traveling, and I'm sure that was fun back then with the sieve and actually going to farmers on boots on the ground and finding SCN for the first time. He has not tested since then. What would you tell him?
Again, I would say you can't test once and then predict for all time what your levels are going to be at. Things change. I mean, like we were talking about, the nematodes adapt. Nematodes move around. Anything that can move soil can move these microscopic worms. And so if you tested back in the late 90s when the first SCN coalition came about, things have changed in 25, 30 years. So it could be that you're at a similar level, but again, you can't know just by looking at the above ground tissue.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you shared with me something about that I found very interesting, and I've been thinking about ever since you told me when we met, but you talked about, and you can go into more detail, how hard it is in breeding from the university standpoint. If you create something or you come up with something new, how easy is it for you to get that to industry, to get it to the farmer?
Yeah. And I will address that, but I just wanted to say, and this is one of the reasons here, so my lab does stuff in the lab, right? We're lab people. We've got nematodes growing in the lab. We've got soybeans growing in the lab. They live in these metal boxes. They don't go outside very often. Sometimes we'll do stuff in a field. If we do, it's that field over there behind the stands. That's the only field we ever do anything in. And a lot of the times you do this, it's not going to work on a farm, right? So there's a lot of this university research. It looks great on paper. It looks great in the lab. It doesn't work in the nematodes from the next county over, let alone the ones down in southern Illinois or near the river. And so if you don't have these projects that bring in nematodes from everywhere else, those allow us to check, at least in the lab, we can say, does it work on these nematodes? Does it work on these nematodes? Not just our little lab rat population. But to go back to what you were saying, I think the big limitation of a lot of this research is because of those things I mentioned, because so many academics do stuff in their lab and then they have a PhD student, and that's their project, they graduate, right? And that's your aim, is you get your student, they write their thesis, they write a paper, and then they're done. And a lot of the industry folks, they look at that and they say, what's the chances of that actually being something we want to invest in? And when they take something from us, so it might cost us more than you think, so probably $200,000, $300,000 more to get a PhD student through the program and do that research. But then industry, they look at that, for them to take that product, get it to market, they're looking at $200, $300 million. And they've got to get it through regulatory, they've got to get it through FDA, they've got to get it through APHIS, and they've got to bulk this up, they've got to test it across the country and maybe also in other countries. So for them to take that bet, it has to be really, really compelling. And it's hard for us to persuade them to take it to the next level. And one of the things that's missing is a way for us to get better information to convince them, right? There's kind of a gap. We can't get those inventions even well enough characterized for them to get excited in most cases. Now, there are some honorable exceptions, especially with the breeders, and they have links, they have ways to do this. We have, Illinois Foundation Seeds and people like that, and so there is a way to do it for Jessica's oat varieties or Eliana's soybean varieties. But even then, it's like they get to be a public variety, but then getting that public variety then turned into something that is Roundup ready or Enlist or whatever, that's another huge investment, and only the companies can do that. And that's why we don't have Enlist Peking varieties. So I think part of the issue is the regulation is very expensive, and only a few companies can get stuff through it, particularly if it's a herbicide resistance trait or something like that. And part of the problem is just this disconnecting culture between academia, where it's partly about training students. And so if you're doing this to train students, it's probably not going to be super professional and super convincing to industry. So I think we both kind of have to work on that and build better links. And one of the things you can do is have your students go to industry and do internships and learn what their standards are for stuff, and that tends to help.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open it up to questions and make Kelsey work. Are there any questions?
Here you go, Bree.
I've got several questions here. So realistically, going back to taking the sample for the first time, you get a baseline. Realistically, how long should we wait before we're taking that next sample? You know, soil tests, we're waiting every 4 years. Is this something that we should probably be on the same rotation?
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned that. So I usually recommend doing it along with the soil testing. You know, every few years, you can set it to presidential election, whatever you want, but doing it on that cycle is pretty reasonable.
What's the wait time for getting those results back?
Yeah, and that was one of the issues that Stephanie was mentioning, the kinks in setting this up. So I'll give you the academic answer, which is it depends. It depends in part. We'll get obviously big push times where we'll get in, we'll get a crop consultant that sends us in 50 samples, and each one takes time to run. So we're trying to get the numbers back to growers within a couple of weeks, but around the holidays, a lot of the workers in the plant clinic are undergraduates. They're going home. So we're trying to get it within a couple of weeks, but there will be times when it goes over that. But
yeah, I just want to give kudos to the ISA and then your lab for that opportunity. It's a neat thing to be able to bring to my growers to give them an idea, especially these high productive growers that want to know, or get to that next level of yield to essentially eliminate or figure out if that's one of the yield robbers in our area. So thank you for that.
Great.
So I used to work at the University of Illinois Plant Clinic many moons ago, and at that time we had the same sort of program. So it was really nice to bring that back. And actually we had a lot of farmers that were asking for that. And so I think we still learn about what's going on out in the field, and I look forward to doing more types of surveys like that. And we have been funding some different types of surveys like that to learn more.
You can test at any time. I mean, the interesting thing about the test results is that that's also a factor in terms of how you interpret it. So if you're getting high numbers and you're going to go into corn, well, that's going to be a little bit less worrisome than if you have high numbers and you're going straight into soybeans. So what I tell people is any time you can get a probe into the ground. So I mean, the past few days, you might have been hard-pressed to go out there and really take some good samples. You can find SCN any time of the year. They don't go anywhere. They're just hunkering down over the winter.
Question right here.
As long as the ground's not frozen.
Yep.
How critical is the procedure from collecting them, getting them to the lab? I know it's supposed to keep it cool, refrigerated.
Yeah, it's actually a little bit less critical than with some of our other nematodes, like nematodes on corn, where we really need them to stay alive with SCN because we're only counting eggs. We don't want them to go too long because you'll start getting microbes in the soil that will start breaking down the eggs, and that can result in changes in the count. So we generally recommend keeping it cool, not frozen, but keeping it, let's say, 40 degrees or so, and getting it to us within a week or two, and that's fine. If it we have samples that we have in our cold room that are months, probably even years old, that we can get viable SCN eggs from. So they're great survivors, which is one of the reasons they're so problematic.
Here you go.
Where are you with the OxyTech program? And I guess as a question,
where are you with the Oxitec program? And then as a follow-up, is the hope that one day you would release the edited variety such that they would kind of sterilize themselves?
Okay, so first of all, we're right at the beginning, and the Oxitec approach, that is patented by these guys. So, and that would be another complication. We're allowed to try it, see if we can get it to work, but if we did get it to work, we would need to work with them to be able to market it. But they might be actually a little more willing to look into this than maybe some of the big ag companies, because this is what they do, and they've done this in a lot of different organisms. But we're right at the beginning, and the limitation right now is you have to make males. So the first thing we have to solve is how do you make male nematodes in large quantities where you can actually release them, and how do you release them? Can you do a seed treatment with male nematodes or something like that? And which genes are active in male nematodes? Because we need to put this gene in, and it needs to be active in the male specifically. So first thing we got to do is make lots of males, figure out what genes they got that are in the males, not the females. And that's what we're focused on right now. That, and actually I'm borrowing his microscope right now because we need a special fancy microscope to be able to try and put the genes in. So the way you do it in nematodes, the standard way of doing it in other nematode species is you get a very, very fine needle and you literally inject the genes into the nematode.
But that's an expensive scope.
It's not the most expensive, but it's pricey. So, but yeah.
It's not like an electron microscope.
No.
Is that one of the most expensive?
Yeah, electron microscope will set you back $500,000.
Well, we've got one on North Campus that I think was $20 million. Electron scope. So they get.
We don't have that much funding.
Got a question right here.
In terms of managing for the nematodes, is there any validity to some of these biocontrols out there, either from like Indigo Ag with some, or like different chitosan products that have, just to try to regulate or control the feeding from the nematodes on soybean roots?
Yeah, so the question was about biological. Now, are you talking about seed treatments or more like
or cover crops or?
Any biological control. I believe, I guess, in the chemistry is where we can at least set the populations back. But I've seen some, thoughts, I guess, on using a biological control like a bacteria that'll.
Oh, okay, yeah.
To where kind of a more season-long control than what the chemistry might be able to provide.
Yeah, so there's definitely there's a lot of research that's done and has been done, and there are commercial products out there, primarily seed coats that are microbial. They're microbial seed coats. A few of them are supposed to coat the root and then serve as an antagonist, so detract the nematodes from attacking them. There's another one that is actually a microbe that will infect the nematode and kill it. A lot of the results that I've seen, I'll see some results where you get an increase in yield. I'll see some results where you knock down the nematode, but you don't see a yield increase. I haven't seen anything where it consistently increases yield and knocks back the nematode. So I think there's potential there, but I haven't seen something that I would bet the farm on.
I've talked to a couple of growers actually that had good results from that, but they said it worked the first year, and then after that, didn't do anything. So I think one of the problems is, just as with the resistant plants, these nematodes adapt really fast. And they probably adapt quicker to the microbes than they do to the plants, because plants have got more tricks up their sleeve.
Yeah, so.
Good question. Any others? So.
Do you have a question right here?
Oh, okay.
So in the next 5 to 8 years, what do you think the primary control for cyst will be?
Well, it's still going to be 88788. I mean, it's being used, and you know, I sometimes feel bad for being all doom and gloom about 88788, but the fact is it's still effective. It's still much better than planting a susceptible variety. You still get control from it. I mean, the fact that 20% of the samples that we got back are zeros, I think is testament to that it's very likely those growers are planting 88788. I think that we will start to, as more Peking varieties get developed and as other sources of resistance get developed. So I think it's still going to be resistance. I think, you know, some of the seed treatments companies are putting a lot of money into that. While I haven't seen anything that's really magic yet, you know, I'm an optimistic guy. I'd like to hope that that's going to happen. And yeah, so, but I think resistance is the mainstay.
I think it's always going to be resistance. We just need to help the plants out any way we can because they're under attack, right? And I think that, but if that yield bump, if you're really getting 20 bushels from Peking and people are seeing that consistently, the companies that's going to move the needle, right? And they're going to start putting Peking type into their LNS lines and stuff like that.
We just need Eliana to work faster, you know, breeding plants. Yeah.
No pressure.
And there's a lot of new resistance sources in the pipe after Peking too. So actually we have a good lineup to go to. It's just getting them into those farm-ready, high-yielding varieties.
Any other questions? So I have, if Kelly Robertson were still here, he'd remind me that there's a lot of customers, especially his customers, especially farmers down in southern Illinois, and not just there, that are planting soybeans on soybeans. And they're still getting great yields. I hear that a lot. What would your advice to them be in regards to soybean cyst nematode?
Well, I would say, you know, be careful. Keep that testing up. You know, again, it could be, if it's effective, great. And if you're getting really low SCN counts, that's fine. I think the issue is that SCN, like a lot of plant parasitic nematodes, is really sort of insidious in that you don't see obvious above ground symptoms. And so if you're happy with your yields, that's good, but would you be happier with higher yields? Probably. And so I think, you know, that's the question, is what would you be getting if you had effective SCN control?
It's the zombie movie again, right? There's always the guy that's like, oh, I don't believe in zombies. And you know, he's always the first one they come for, right? Yeah. But there are populations. There's a lot of variation in these populations, and we see that. And there's probably some local populations that find it harder than others to adapt to that 88788 type resistance, just through luck. But things move around, right? They move around on the wheels of tractors and harvesters, and you know, you don't know when you're going to get the bad nematodes in your field if you've got the ones that the resistance is working on right now. So as those populations get mixed up and expand, you might not have a problem now, but you might in the future. So again, I think keeping up with your counts, because there may be, you know, the zombies may be starting on you and you haven't seen them yet.
What do you say to those guys in the south?
Ooh, I'm coming.
Wouldn't you say the guys in the South, you're talking about the South, but they don't know what they don't know. So that's why we have to do this testing to even give us a baseline of what, you know, what's going on. So they probably don't even know that they have a problem or they don't have a problem. So yield really, so they feel like the yield is really good, but they could, like you said, could be more, but they just don't know what they don't know.
And they don't have a check, really.
Right.
I don't have a question. Okay. Very good.
All right. All right, anything else before we wrap up here? Any last things that you would like to talk about? I'll give that opportunity, and then I have one last question. Anything that we didn't address?
Just to reiterate, free SCN test. So free SCN testing at illinois.edu. can email us and find out more information about where to send samples, how to send samples, all that good stuff. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
And yeah, well, and thank you for all the support and input, and it's really useful to know what it is people are needing. It's also useful, I think, to understand that despite what we hear elsewhere, there's a lot of people having trouble with SCN out there. And that just knowing that there are farmers that are struggling with it and that they want to continue to support us, that's really important. And we're happy to respond to any and all comments and questions.
So I think Nate pointed out to me, and I feel this way too, from a plant pathologist / I didn't go into nematology, there was a reason. And if you've ever done SCN testing, it is not fun, just so you know. It's about as fun as being a soybean breeder. It's not one of your top jobs. Would you say it's probably, it would be hard to find a worker, probably, to be completely honest, to do that type of work.
I actually kind of like, I love looking under the microscope.
We're happy you like it.
Yeah, I like it. I wish I had more time to.
Yeah, so I went more on the disease side of it. But with nematodes, we talk about it all the time. And I know, Pam, you've written about this constantly. And I think we almost get to a point that we become numb to it. And so what would you both say to that? And what is your message to farmers?
Don't become numb. I don't have a great strategy except to say, it is out there. It hasn't gone away. It's not going away anytime soon. Yeah, it may have lost some of its sex appeal compared to red crown rot or tar spot or any of those other diseases that are really in your face. But it's there. We still consider it to be the most important yield-robbing pathogen of soybeans in the Midwest. So, yeah, keep an eye on it.
And yeah, I mean, if you're growing the same lines from the same supplier year after year after year, and you may think that they're great, but maybe it's worth trying a small area of another variety if you can get hold of it, just to see if that does give you that yield bump, because you may just be benefiting from all this genetics, all these billions of dollars the companies are spending inching that up, and it's keeping you flat. But actually, the nematodes are robbing you of what you could have there.
So to end, if you had a wish list for the ISA, Illinois Soybean Association, what would you ask for? If we were Santa, what would you want? How can we help?
Well, I've got something, because
I'm catching him off guard, by the way.
I think ISA, USB, North Central, you guys have the ears of a lot of these companies, and because you're farmer-driven and farmer-directed. And I think you can really help us kind of spread these messages. Like sometimes we say these things, and sometimes the farmer's like, I'm fine. Maybe a few people have this problem, but if you're all feeling the problem, then if you start asking for endless, approved peaking type resistance, then if you start asking the companies for it, they might do something about it. They tend not to listen.
And I think we have a similar issue if Dr. Bond was here with root knot nematode in the South. And so we're trying to get the word out. Root knot nematode is there. And we have a lot of varieties that don't have, in our maturities that we grow down south, that don't have the root knot nematode resistance in them. So that's another way to add to your comment, another example of that story.
Yeah, I guess what came to my mind, I was just asked to contribute to this book chapter on lesion nematodes. So this is a different genus of nematode, plant parasitic nematodes, Pratolynchus. They're everywhere in Illinois. They oftentimes get referred to as corn nematodes because they do feed on corn, but they are also happy feeding on soybeans. They don't care, as long as they have a plant to feed on, they'll feed on it. We have no idea what their impact is on soybean. They're all over the state. When we've done corn surveys, we find them in 80% of fields. There are other plant parasitic species. How are they interacting with soybean cyst nematode. They may be, contributing sort of a synergistic effect, and we don't know. So I think there's a lot of open space in that area to think about, okay, what are these other organisms doing?
Okay. Well, thank you both so much for being here. For the CCAs, don't forget your sign-up sheets in the back of the room to claim your CEU credits. If you're attending online, please follow the CEU instructions provided in the chat. And lastly, to all of you, thank you so much for joining us today at our first Field Advisor Forum at Memorial Stadium. We put a lot of work into this. Kelsey, thank you for all the work you've done, and Lauren and everybody else on the team. It takes a lot to put on an event, and it also takes speakers to come and make this event what it is. So just thank you so much. We hope you gained some actionable information, connected, did networking, and found this experience worthwhile. So this concludes today's event. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again. And if you want to follow along, we're on fieldadvisor.org. Thank you.